"Fire under the stand. The stand's going to fall." The man said it low, the way you say a thing you want to spread instead of stop, and he said it in the densest part of the crowd, where 40,000 people were pressed shoulder to shoulder along the Coronation Mile waiting for a king to ride by, and I felt the whole street tighten like a held breath. I was 8 men down the rope line from where it started, but I saw the first ripple of it before I heard the words. A crowd is a single body when it is packed that hard. It has one nervous system. One wrong word can travel through it faster than any of us can run, and a word like that, on a day like that, in a chute of stone barely wide enough for the procession itself, that word could kill more people than any blade ever drawn in that city. I knew it the instant the man's mouth moved. I think a part of me knew it before he spoke, because I had been watching him for 11 minutes already, and I will tell you why. But first I have to tell you about the man 8 places to my left, the man the words were aimed at without the speaker even knowing it, because this is his story and not mine. I only watched it. His name was Sergeant Talric Maene, of the King's Own Foot Guard, and on the morning the Kingdom of Aldermere crowned its new sovereign, he was the still point that the panic broke itself against. Let me set you in it. The Coronation Mile is the old processional way that runs from the Abbey of St. Velen to the gates of the High Court, a straight stone canyon flanked by buildings 4 stories tall, and on coronation morning it becomes the narrowest, most crowded place in the realm. They had built timber viewing stands against the buildings on both sides, 6 tiers high, packed with families who had queued through the night for a place. Between the stands ran the rope line, and on the rope line, every 15 feet, stood a man of the King's Own in full ceremonial order, red tunic, tall black bearskin, white gloves, the rifle at the order, eyes forward. We were the wall between 40,000 people and the 4 feet of empty cobble the king would ride down. Our orders that day were the simplest and the hardest we ever take. Hold the line. Whatever happens behind you in the crowd is the constable's affair and the marshal's affair. Your affair is the line and the procession. A guard who breaks the line to chase a pickpocket has opened a gap a horse could bolt through. So we stand, and we trust the men whose job is the crowd to do the crowd, and we hold our 4 feet of empty stone as if our lives, and a great many other lives, depended on it. Which that morning they did. I had drawn the post beside Maene by the luck of the roster. I had served under him 2 years, and I will tell you the plain truth of the man. He was the most boring soldier I ever knew, and I mean that as the highest thing I can say about anyone. Boring the way a foundation is boring. He did not have stories. He did not have opinions you had to step around. He had a way of standing that made you feel the ground was sounder under his boots than under yours. New men thought he was simple. Then they watched him hold a post through a thunderstorm, without one drop of his attention going to the rain, and they understood they had been the simple ones. So when I tell you that, 11 minutes before the words, I saw Maene's eyes move, you must understand how rare that was. We are trained to keep our eyes on the middle distance, fixed, level, unmoving. Maene's eyes came off the middle distance and went, for half a second, to a man in the 3rd row of the stand directly across from us. Then they went back. I followed where they had gone, because in 2 years I had learned that when Maene looked at something it was worth my looking too. The man was perhaps 40, well dressed in a gray coat, ordinary in every way a man can be ordinary. He was not waving a flag. He was not lifting a child to see. Everyone around him in that stand was straining toward the empty street, alive with waiting. He alone was looking at the crowd. He was looking at the people, and at the timber struts under the tiers, and at the 2 narrow stair-gaps that were the only ways down out of the stand, and at the choke point 40 yards along where the mile pinched between 2 old buttresses. He was reading the street the way a thief reads a house. And every minute or two he would lean and say something to the people nearest him, and I watched their faces change. A flicker of unease passed on, person to person, like a coin moving down a row of hands. I could not leave my post to reach him, none of us could, and he knew it. That was the whole of his plan. I understood later. He had chosen the one place in the kingdom where the men best able to stop him were the men least able to move. I leaned the smallest amount toward Maene, lips barely moving, the way you learn to speak on a line without breaking your bearing. "Gray coat, third row, he's casing it." "I have him," Maene said. He had him, I realized, for 11 minutes. "Pass it back to Corwin. Corwin passes it to the marshal on the gap." I passed it. It went man to man down the rope, mouth to ear, the message a hand-built telegraph of guardsmen. "Gray coat, third row of the east stand, watch him." It would reach the marshal in a minute, maybe 2. The marshal could move. We could not. But the man in the gray coat had a clock too, and his clock was the procession. From far up the mile, faint under the roar, came the first deep note of the abbey bells and the brass of the vanguard band. The king was coming. The crowd surged forward against the rope with a sound like the sea finding a new shore, every soul in 40,000 leaning toward the sight they had waited a lifetime for. The pressure on the rope line doubled in a heartbeat. I felt it in my own boots, the whole weight of a city pushing at 4 feet of empty stone. And in that exact moment, the moment the crowd was at its tightest and its most blind, every eye turned up the street, every body pressed into the body in front of it. The man in the gray coat came down out of the third row to the rope's edge, cupped his hands, and shouted into the densest part of the press the words designed to turn 40,000 people into a single panicked animal. "Fire, fire under the stand. It's going to fall, run, get out, run." I have heard rifles fired beside my ear. I have heard a horse scream. I have never heard anything that froze the blood in me like those words in that place, because I knew, the way you know a dropped glass will break before it lands, exactly what they were built to do. 40,000 people, packed in a stone funnel with 2 stair gaps and 1 choke point. A word like a struck match, and every man who could have caught it before it spread was nailed to a rope line he could not leave. The body of the crowd jolted. I felt the jolt come down the rope into my hands. The held breath of 40,000 people broke, and in the half-second before it became a scream, before it became a stampede that would have crushed children against the buttresses and folded the timber stands like paper, there was one fixed point in all that street that did not move. 8 places to my left, Sergeant Talric Maene stood exactly as he had stood for the past hour. And then, into the gathering scream, without leaving his post, he did the one thing the man in the gray coat had not planned for. He brought his right boot down on the cobbles. It was the simplest thing in the world. The stamp a guardsman makes coming to the present, the stamp of drill, iron heel on stone, except that Maene put the whole discipline of his life into it, and it cracked across the Coronation Mile like a single clean shot. In a crowd that was about to scream, one hard, deliberate, unhurried sound that was not a scream, a sound with no fear in it at all. I cannot fully explain to you what a stamp like that does to a frightened crowd, except to say I felt it work in my own chest. A panic spreads because every person takes their cue from the person beside them, and the cue is fear. Fear says, "That man is afraid, so I should be afraid, so I should run." The whole horror of a stampede is that it is a conversation in which everyone agrees too fast, and into that conversation, before the agreement could close, came one sound that said the opposite. A man near me, half turned to bolt, stopped with his weight already shifting and looked toward the sound. Because the thing about a crowd that has only ever seen ceremonial guards is that, underneath everything, they trust us. We are the men who do not move. We have stood at their gates through their whole lives, through rain and dark and every kind of trouble, and never once broken. So in the half-second, when 40,000 people were deciding whether to believe the screaming man in the gray coat or the still men on the rope, a great many of them turned, by instinct, to look at the soldier. And the soldier was not running. That alone bought us perhaps 2 seconds. 2 seconds is nothing. 2 seconds is everything. In a stampede, the difference between 40,000 dead and 40,000 frightened is measured in exactly that, the breath in which a crowd decides which way to go. Maene used the breath. He did not shout, "Stay calm," because a man shouting "stay calm" in a panic only proves there is a reason to panic. He did the opposite of shouting. He turned his head, only his head, slowly, the way a man turns who has all the time in the world and nothing at all to fear, toward the timber stand the gray-coated man had named. He looked at it. He looked at it for one long, deliberate, unhurried second, the way you look at a thing to confirm it is perfectly fine. And then he looked back to his front, unbothered, and brought his rifle up from the order to the slope across his body in one crisp ceremonial motion, the motion of a man taking up his proper bearing for the arrival of his king. It was a lie told in the language of the body, and it was true. There was no fire. He knew there was no fire because he had been watching the gray-coated man for 11 minutes and had seen him touch nothing, light nothing, leave nothing. He had only words, and Maene answered the words with the one argument a crowd will believe over any shout. A trained man, looking straight at the danger, finding it not worth his concern. I watched it travel. The man beside me who had shifted to run settled back onto both feet. A woman too rose up in the stand who had grabbed her husband's arm, followed Maene's gaze to the timber, saw a guardsman regard it and dismiss it, and loosened her grip. The unease that the gray-coated man had spent 11 minutes seeding, the coin he had passed down the row of hands, stopped moving. It did not reverse all at once, but it stopped. And in a crowd, a panic that stops spreading is a panic that dies. The gray-coated man felt it stop. I saw his face when he felt it. He had expected the words to do the work. Words had always done his work. I would learn. And he had expected to be already moving away through the chaos he'd made, toward whatever he had come to do under the cover of 40,000 people running. But the chaos had not come. The crowd had hitched, swayed, and held. And the man understood, with the particular fury of someone whose certain thing has failed, that he was now a man standing alone at a rope line, shouting fire in a place where there was no fire, with a soldier 8 feet away regarding the timber as if it were a pleasant view. So he tried again, louder. "There's a bomb, they've put a bomb under the stand. Save your children, run." It was a worse word than fire, and on another morning, in another second, it might have worked. But he had spent his first shout, and a crowd that has already once looked to the still man and found him unmoved will look to him again faster the second time. Heads turned to Maene before they turned to the gray coat. And Maene, and this is the thing I have told and retold for 15 years and still cannot say without a tightness in my throat, Maene did not even look at the man this time. He let his eyes stay forward up the mile, toward the brass and the bells and the first banners of the vanguard coming into view. He gave the screaming man nothing, not a glance, not the smallest acknowledgement that anything in the world had been said. He stood at the slope, immaculate eyes up the street, a man waiting for his king, and his perfect, total indifference said to 40,000 people, more loudly than any denial, "There is nothing here. The soldier isn't even listening. It's only that man. It's only that man." I watched the thought cross the crowd like wind across a field of wheat. The faces near the gray coat, which had been turning toward whatever danger he named, now turned toward him, toward the source of the shouting. And a crowd that has stopped being afraid and started being annoyed is the safest crowd in the world. "Sit down," a big man behind him said, the first ordinary voice in all of it. "You're scaring the little ones for nothing." "There's no fire, love," a woman told her children, loud enough for the rows around her, in the firm, bright voice mothers used to make a thing true by saying it. "Look, the soldier's not worried. Watch the soldier." Watch the soldier. They were watching the soldier. The gray-coated man had built his whole plan on the certainty that in the crucial moment every eye would be on the street, blind, easy to spook from behind. He had not reckoned that when you frighten people in front of a man they trust, they do not look at the fright. They look at the man, and the man gave them stone. Now I have to tell you what was happening that the crowd could not see, because the stillness was only the front of it. The way the calm face of a working dam is only the front of a great deal of moving water. From the corner of my eye, While Maene held the crowd with his bearing, I could see what his hands and his voice had been doing in the 11 minutes before the shout and in the seconds since. He had passed the word. That message I had sent down the rope, gray coat, third row, watch him, had not stopped at me. Maene had been building it for 11 minutes before I ever noticed the man. A quiet chain of mouth to ear running both ways down the line and through the marshal at the gap, into the radio net of the men whose job was the crowd. By the time the gray coat shouted fire, the marshals already knew exactly where he was. 2 plainclothes constables had already begun working through the stand toward the third row from above, where the man could not see them coming because he was watching the street, just as he had assumed everyone would be. He had made himself blind to the very thing he had taught everyone else to be. And there was one more thing Maene had done, the thing I understood only later, the thing that turned a prevented panic into a caught man. When his eyes had first come off the middle distance 11 minutes before, when he had read the gray coat casing the choke points and the stair gaps, Maene had not just watched him. He had memorized him. The gray of the coat, the set of the shoulders, the particular way the man stood apart from the joy around him. And he had passed that down the line too, not just where the man was, but who the man was, so completely that when the panic came and the man tried to melt back into 40,000 bodies, there would be no melting. He had nailed the man's description into a dozen disciplined memories before the man had said a single word. The gray coat made his third attempt then, and it was the desperate one, the one that told me he knew he had lost. He stopped shouting fire. He stopped shouting bomb. He simply began to shove, driving his shoulder into the people around him, trying to start with his own body the surge he could not start with his words, trying to make a stampede the way a man tries to push a stalled cart by main force. And 40,000 people, who a moment before had been deciding whether to trust him with their lives, watched a grown man in a gray coat shoving children aside to make them run, and the last of his power died. The big man behind him caught his collar, not a blow, just a fist of gray wool, a working man's grip, holding him where he was. "That's enough of that," he said. 2 more hands joined it from the rows around. The crowd that the gray coat had tried to turn into a weapon now closed around him gently and held him fast, the way a body closes around a splinter, and held him for the constables coming down from above. And up the mile, into the silence where a stampede should have been, came the king. I will not pretend I saw much of the procession. I had my own 4 feet of stone to hold, and I held it. But I will tell you what I felt, because the whole street felt it together. The vanguard band came first, and then the household cavalry, the hooves loud and even on the cobbles, and then the great gilded carriage with the new sovereign of Aldermere inside it, and 40,000 people who had, 90 seconds before, stood a single wrong word from catastrophe, lifted up a roar of pure joy that rolled down the stone canyon like a wave coming home. Flags, children on shoulders, an old man near me weeping openly and not minded. The whole bright tide of it pouring down a street that had very nearly become a grave, and not one soul in it the wiser, because the man whose job was to hold the line had held it, and the man whose job was to start the panic had been stopped before the panic could start. The king passed our post. I held my present. 8 places to my left, Sergeant Talric Maene held his eyes forward, rifle at the slope, the same boring, unbreakable foundation he had been all morning. And as the gilded carriage went by, no one in it and no one in the crowd had the least idea that the man in the red tunic standing so perfectly still had, 2 minutes before, stood between them all and the worst day in the kingdom's memory. That is the part I have never been able to make people understand. The greatest thing I ever saw a soldier do, he did so well that almost no one knew it had happened. They took the gray coat out through the back of the stand. Quiet, no scene, the way these things are best done, 2 constables and the marshal, and the man went without a fight because the fight had gone out of him the moment his words failed. As they led him along the back of the line, he passed within 10 feet of our post, and he looked at Maene. I was close enough to see his face, and I have thought about that face for 15 years. It was not the face of a madman. That is the thing people always want it to be afterward, because a madman is a comfortable thing. A madman is weather, a thing that happens, a thing no one is responsible for. But the gray coat was not mad. His eyes were clear and cold, and full of a terrible, baffled fury, the fury of a man who had planned a thing carefully and watched it come apart on something he had not weighed. And what he had not weighed was a soldier who would not move. "You should have run," he said to Maene low as they took him past. "If you'd run, they'd all have run. One soldier breaks and the whole thing goes. I only needed one of you to break." Maene did not turn his head. He was still on his post. The king was barely past. He would no more have spoken on duty than he would have flown. But I was close, and I will tell you that something happened in his face. Not a break, nothing the crowd could have seen, just the smallest possible movement at the corner of his eyes, and the gray coat saw it, and it was not what he wanted to see. He had wanted contempt or anger or fear. What he got was a kind of quiet, level understanding, the look of a man who has read you completely and finds you smaller than you hoped. Then Maene's eyes went forward again, and the man was gone behind us, and that was the last either of us saw of him for a long while. I learned the rest in pieces, over the weeks that followed, the way a guardsman learns anything, from the duty officer, from the inquiry, from a constable I drank with who had been on the stand. The gray coat's name does not matter, and I will not give it even if I could. Men like him want their names, and the kindest thing the kingdom did to him in the end was to make sure no one remembered it. But his purpose, when it came out, was almost worse for being so small. He had not come to harm the king. He had no quarrel with the crown at all. He had come for the procession's purse, for the coronation's strongbox, the great chest of ceremonial gold, and the gifts of the provinces that traveled in a guarded wagon at the rear of the column, the most heavily watched object in the kingdom on the most heavily watched day in a generation. He had reasoned cleverly that the one moment that wagon's guard would thin to nothing was the moment 40,000 people ran. A stampede would pull every constable, every marshal, every spare hand toward saving lives. The strongbox would be left in a sea of running people, and a man who had planned his routes, the choke point, the stair-gaps, the back alleys behind the buttresses, could be gone with what he could carry before anyone thought of gold again. So he had not needed the crowd to be hurt. He had only needed it to run. The dead children would have been, to him, a cost of doing business, a thing he had decided in advance not to think about, the way such men always decide. He had weighed 40,000 lives against a wagon of gold and found the gold heavier, and the only thing in the whole kingdom that had tipped the scale back was one sergeant who declined to be the first man to run. I think about that arithmetic more than I should. A panic is the cheapest weapon in the world. It costs nothing. It needs no blade, no powder, no strength. It needs only a crowd, a word, and one frightened man to start the running, and the man who starts it risks nothing himself, because he means to be moving the other way. The gray coat had understood all of this perfectly. He had built a weapon out of human nature itself, and aimed it at the most crowded place in the realm, and the genius of it, the real cruelty of it, was that he had chosen the one ground where the men best able to stop a panic, the king's own, were the men forbidden to leave their posts to do it. He had been right about almost everything. He had been right about the crowd, the timing, the choke points, the gold. He had made exactly one error, and it was an error of the kind that men like him always make because they cannot help it. He had assumed that a man who is not allowed to move is the same as a man who is helpless. He had looked at the rope line and seen 40 soldiers nailed in place, unable to chase him, unable to reach him, and he had thought, "Those men cannot stop me." He had not understood that the not moving was the weapon. He had not understood that a soldier who holds his post in a panic is not a soldier who has been prevented from acting. He is a soldier in the very act of doing the one thing the moment requires. He had brought a crowd to the edge of running, and reasoned that no still man could stop it. And a still man stopped it, precisely by being still, because the stillness was the only argument in that street that the crowd would believe. There was an inquiry, of course. There always is after a near thing, and this had been the nearest of things, even if hardly anyone knew it. They held it quietly in a paneled room of the High Court, 3 weeks on, and they called Maene to it, and they called me, and they called the marshals and the constables and the big working man who had caught the gray coat by the collar. The man in the gray coat was brought to it too, under guard and given the chance to speak, because the kingdom is the kingdom, and even a man like that is heard. And he chose, I think because pride was the only thing he had left, to defend himself not by denying what he had done, but by arguing that what he had done was nothing because nothing had happened. No fire, no bomb, no stampede, no one hurt, no gold taken. He had shouted some words at a crowd, he said, and a crowd is free to ignore words, and it had, and where then was the crime? He stood in that paneled room and argued that he should walk free because he had failed. I watched him make that argument, and I watched it land on the faces of the panel, and for one cold moment I was afraid it might work, because the law is a careful thing and there had, after all, been no bodies. And then they called Maene back to the stand and asked him one question. They asked him, in his judgment as the soldier nearest the event, how close had the crowd come? And Maene, who never in 2 years had said 10 words where one would do, looked at the panel, and then he looked at the gray coat, and he said the only long thing I ever heard him say. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "You're asking how close the crowd came. The crowd was never the danger. The crowd was 40,000 decent people having the best morning of their lives. The danger was one man who knew exactly how to take that and turn it into a thing that kills, and who stood in the safest place in it, in the middle of the people he meant to crush, and pulled the trigger of the cheapest weapon there is, knowing he'd be walking away from the blast. You ask how close we came. We came as close as the half-second between his mouth and theirs. I have stood at the gate when men came at it with steel. I would take the steel every time over what that man brought, because steel you can see and a panic you cannot, and the man who starts a panic has worked out that the law has trouble seeing it too. He's counting on that in this room right now. He failed to kill anyone. He did not fail to try. A man who fires into a crowd and misses is not an innocent man. He is a bad shot." The room was very quiet. "He says nothing happened," Maene said. "Something happened." 40,000 people stood for 90 seconds on the edge of a grave he dug for them, and they will never know it. And that is the only mercy in this whole business, that they get to remember the day their king was crowned, and not the day their children died in the mile. That mercy is not his doing. He did everything in his power to take it from them. The only reason this is an inquiry and not a funeral is that the moment ran a few inches the right way instead of the wrong way, and he does not get to claim those inches as his innocence. They were never his to give. He stopped. He had not raised his voice once. He stood at attention through all of it the way he stood everywhere, and when he was done, he simply waited, and the silence in that paneled room was the same silence I had felt in the street, the silence of people who have just understood something true. The gray coat did not look clever anymore. That was the moment his humbling truly landed, not in the street, where his words had failed, but here, where his last defense failed, the careful argument he had built to walk away on. He had spent his life trusting that the world could not see the thing he did, that a panic leaves no fingerprints, that the man who starts the running and runs the other way is always just a bystander who shouted. And a boring sergeant who had watched him for 11 minutes had seen all of it, named all of it, and laid it on the table in plain words a child could follow. He had been seen, completely, for exactly what he was. There is no humbling worse than that for a man whose whole craft was being invisible. They did not let him walk. The law found the words for it. There are old words, it turns out, for a man who endangers a multitude, words written by people who understood crowds long before that morning, and he was sent where such men are sent. And the kingdom, as I said, did him the one kindness of forgetting his name. But I have gotten ahead of the part that matters, which is not the man in the gray coat at all. He was only the storm. The story is the still point, and I owe you the rest of it, because for 15 years I have watched people misunderstand what Sergeant Talric Maene did that morning, and I want at least one telling of it set down right. The newspapers, when a thin version of it leaked, called it courage, and that is not wrong, but it is not the heart of it either. Courage is what you call a thing when you imagine the man was afraid and did it anyway. And I have no doubt Maene was afraid. Any man with sense would be, standing in a stone funnel feeling 40,000 people start to break. But fear was not the thing he conquered that morning. The thing he conquered was the oldest pull there is, the pull to do something. When a crowd starts to run, every nerve in your body screams at you to move, to act, to join the motion, because motion feels like survival and stillness feels like death. The gray coat had counted on exactly that scream. He knew that a frightened man's deepest instinct is to run, and he believed that even a soldier in the end is a frightened man. And Maene's whole life had been the slow, unglamorous building of a man who could feel that scream and not obey it. 22 years of standing still. 22 years of holding a post when nothing was happening, of being mocked as a statue and a toy soldier, and a man with no inside to him, of stamping a wet square at 3 in the morning with no one watching, of the daily, boring, invisible work of teaching his own body that the post comes before the impulse. People think discipline is for the great moments. It isn't. The great moment is just the one time in a life when all those small, dull, unwatched moments are suddenly worth everything they cost. The gray coat had never built such a man, and could not imagine one, and that failure of imagination was the inch the whole thing turned on. I asked him about it once, a year later, the two of us off duty, the way you can finally ask a man a thing when the uniform is on a peg. I asked him how he had known not to run, how he had been so certain there was no fire that he could stake 40,000 lives on his own stillness. He thought about it for a while the way he thought about everything, as if words were a resource not to be wasted. I didn't stake their lives on it, he said at last. I watched him for 11 minutes. He never lit anything. He never carried anything that could light. A man setting a real fire is busy with his hands. That man was busy with his eyes. I knew there was no fire the way you know a thing you've watched. The crowd didn't have that. They only had his shout and my stillness to choose between. He turned his cup on the table, so I had to be more certain than his shout. That's all it was. He was loud. I had to be quiet in a way that was louder. Quiet in a way that was louder. I have never heard a better description of what discipline is for. And if you'd been wrong, I asked him, if there had been a fire. He looked at me, and there was that level understanding in him again, the thing the gray coat had seen and hated. Then I'd have been the man who stood still while people burned, he said simply. I know what I risked. A guard who holds when he should hold is a hero, and a guard who holds when he should have moved is a monster, and on the morning itself they look exactly alike. The only thing that tells them apart is whether he read the moment right. That's the part nobody puts in the stories. They want it to be brave. It isn't only brave. It's a judgment a man makes in a half-second that he'll answer for the rest of his life. I made mine. I'd have answered for it either way. He drank. I happened to be right, but I want you to know I knew the size of the bet. I have carried that with me longer than almost anything else I learned in the King's Own. We tell the young men that the post comes first, that they must not break the line, that whatever happens behind them in the crowd is not their affair, and that is true, and it must be true, or the whole thing falls apart. But Maene knew the harder truth underneath it, that obedience is not the same as judgment, that there are mornings when holding the line is the bravest thing a man can do and mornings when it would be the worst, and that the soldier himself in the half-second is the only one who can tell which morning it is. He did not hide behind his orders. He read the street, weighed the bet and chose to hold, and the choosing was the courage, far more than the standing. The king never knew. I want to say that plainly because people always ask. There was no medal, no audience, no moment where the sovereign of Aldermere rose and named the man who had saved his coronation from becoming its catastrophe. The whole point of what Maene did was that it left no mark. A panic prevented leaves nothing behind, no wreckage, no wounded, no proof, only an ordinary happy day that might have been something else. The gray coat had built a weapon that would have been blamed on bad luck in a crowded street, and Maene had defeated it with a weapon that looked, to everyone watching, like a soldier simply doing nothing at all. That is the cruelty and the glory of it together. The better he did his job, the less it could be seen that he had done anything.